Dr. Susan Bonis. And Dr. Susan Bonis, the title of the grant she received was Parental Stress, Self-Management, Risks and Protector Factors for Access to a Diagnosis and Services for a Child with Autism Spectrum Disorder. She received the MNRS STTI grant back in 2017.
I'd like to say thank you to the donors and the board for making this opportunity possible, because it helped me with my research, but most importantly, it helped the local community of parents of children with autism. So a little bit about the background. 1 in 54 children are diagnosed with on the autism spectrum, and their parents measure higher levels of stress than other groups of parents. In the literature, the stress has been primarily attributed to the child's challenging behaviors. However, I wasn't able to find anything that described these challenges or how these challenges varied or affected parents, especially as the child transitioned to adulthood and independence. Inconsistent findings about delayed diagnosis were related to race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. The grant aims evolved and were developed as a result of a paper and pencil survey that parents responded to questions about their experience seeking a diagnosis and services. I was left with more questions than answered, so did a thorough review of literature in preparation for this grant application. As a result of the survey, I found that parents spent 2 to 10 years seeking answers for their child's challenging behaviors and communication issues. They discontinued services typically before desired outcomes were achieved. So I was left with more questions than answers on that. The review of literature revealed that parents from all backgrounds experience disparity related to autism. African-American and Hispanic parents receive later diagnoses for their children, despite similarities in symptomology, and parents from lower socioeconomic and rural areas also receive later diagnoses. In my survey, there were no differences in racial, ethnicity, socioeconomic, employment, or educational background. And we live in an area that is rich in autism services. So that was another reason to seek more information about factors that impact early diagnosis, as well as factors aimed to that affect entry into autism interventional services and why parents discontinue services before optimal outcomes are achieved. So the findings. 3 questions were asked in a community engaged research design. What was your experience before? What was your experience since? And what does that mean to you? And the questions were left intentionally vague so that I would not guide their answers into something that I already knew. I wanted to open it to what the parents' experiences were. And I'll say first that overwhelmingly parents did not attribute their stress to their child's behavior or to their child at all. In accordance with the phenomenological approach to interview, thematic analysis was employed to organize data according to themes. Accordingly, stress is attributed to the following categories: to access to services and information and support for the child. Guardianship was the first theme because it seemed to affect all of the themes. As a child, access to diagnosis was troublesome as a child transitioned to adult age, because as a child becomes an adult and the parent doesn't have guardianship, the parent doesn't have access or control over seeking medical treatment or services. Challenges emerged as a child transitioned to an adult because HIPAA and FERPA created a barrier between access to parents' knowledge and ability to communicate with healthcare providers. And challenges also emanated primarily from denial acceptance and seeking healthcare services and executive functioning. Parents in this study across all ethnic, educational, and socioeconomic backgrounds experienced difficulty accessing diagnosis and services for their child. 18 of the 24 received informal diagnoses from K through 12, not from a healthcare provider. And because a child's needs were met in the school system on an as-needed basis, These parents gave up seeking a diagnosis from a healthcare provider. This turned into a problem as a child became an adult, because first of all, the services accessed in K through 12 ceased. And because a child didn't have a diagnosis, wasn't able to access services as an adult. And then again, access to a diagnosis became another challenge. As parents of children with coexisting conditions or children that were lower functioning tended to receive the services that they needed, whether they were blind or cognitively impaired or had epilepsy or physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities. They were able to receive services for these coexisting conditions, but parents of children who were higher functioning and did not have a diagnosis of autism weren't able to help their child at all and experienced more stress due to I'm sorry, I lost my words here. Due to the lack of ability to communicate socially, to express their concerns, or to manage the stress associated with their diagnosis. It was not an inconsistent theme for children to leave home, to become homeless, for parents to lose track of them. Mental health symptoms arose and escalated, and violence was an overarching issue. Stigmatization is the word I was trying to remember. I'm sorry about that. Violence was one of the biggest and most enlightening issues for all of the parents. Once one parent talked about the violence, other parents came forward one by one and were relieved, yet distressed to discover they were not the only one, and that it was a consistent theme across the board. Little children have meltdowns. Big people have violent episodes. And when these violent episodes would go to the authorities, the child would be chaptered, the case would go to court, and 100% of the time, the judge would hand over a referral to a homeless shelter. And this was most distressing because the next theme arose that these adult children needed to get out of their parents' house. But independent housing, and even protected independent housing, wasn't an option. Parents were frustrated. They needed that physical separation, but group living was not an option because the autistic behaviors didn't fit in with the nature of the group housing that supported adults with mental illness. There was support needed for executive functioning. Most of these adult children didn't want to give up their independence, yet they needed assistance with executive functioning. And when they did live independently, eviction became a real problem. Their sensory sensitivity, their social intrusion, compliance was one end of the problem. And the other end of the problem is if they had housing, they were often manipulated to have people move in with them. And then that was a violation of the lease, and so they were evicted. Education became another issue and employment, as these adult children needed a means to support themselves. So education, although most of the adult children in the study had some college education, one even had 3 bachelor's degrees and 2 master's degrees. They were unemployed. Many didn't finish their education because of the stress anxiety in college settings created a barrier. Bullying and incivility was a barrier. Sensory adaptation, support and AD adaptations were needed and weren't offered. And all of these issues led to motivational challenges, and the children, most of them eventually dropped out of college. Across the board, the parents talked about their children being very bright, some of them having degrees, yet they sat in their bedrooms and played video games. We're not interested in being social. We're not interested in going to school. We're not interested in getting a job. One child, as I said, had bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and was unemployed, never employed. employers, colleagues, and employers and colleagues were uninformed about the challenges of autism. When a child would get a job, they would interview with a certain individual. That individual would hire them, knowing that their behaviors were quirky. Often the children would disclose what their challenges were, but then when that person would move on to a different position and a new person would come in, that person would lose their job. So the most common length of stay in one job would be 3 years before losing a job. And so most of the adults with autism were underemployed or unemployed. Socialization was another issue. Peer acceptance is challenging. It got to the point for these children that it was no longer worth the effort to try to make friends or keep friends. Part of these challenges were due to their intense focal interest and reciprocal conversation issues. It's hard to maintain a friendship when one person goes into a 2-hour monologue. Safety became an issue because of bullying and incivility. Focal interests could be a problem. One interesting story that I found quite disturbing and had to empathize with was a Black mom and grandma had their 12-year-old child/grandchild on the front porch because there was a crime scene out on the street and the area was taped off. And as a police officer walked up the sidewalk to ask if they had seen anything, the child, who has an intense focus and interest on guns, reached for the police officer's gun. And so together, the mother and grandmother pulled the child back and explained to the officer, but expressed extreme concern about what if they weren't there, and there will be a time when they aren't there. And so, you know, that the stressors that go along with socialization issues lead to a high incidence of suicide practice and attempts in the autism community. And parents shared that. And once one parent shared it, more parents shared it. The parents who weren't aware of it became aware of it in their own children. And last but not least, expectations was an overarching theme that affected all areas of the child's life, as well as parental stress. And the longer I mulled over this study, the more I realized it wasn't just the parents' expectations for their child. It was the parents' expectations for themselves. It was the parents' expectation of others, of peers to make exceptions for their child, of employers to make exceptions, of healthcare providers to be aware, of the legal community to be aware, and overall parental expectations aren't being met by those in the family and in the community. Greater stress was experienced by parents who blamed the behaviors on the diagnosis. They typically had lower expectations for their child and found that their child wasn't successful in school, wasn't successful in employment, was not successful in socialization, and was living with them, was not being independent. The parents who had higher expectations for their children seemed to have lower stress, were more proactive. They worked with their children, they held their children accountable. There were consequences for those children. They actively sought opportunities for their children, provided opportunities, and if opportunities weren't available, developed opportunities. And so we developed a saying in the group that children live down to our highest expectations of them. So my next steps, I've accomplished a lot. I realized in reviewing this, the accomplishments are ongoing. The biggest success was in engaging the autism community, including the Autism Society and the parents and their children in involvement of identifying and addressing needs and solutions. And there were 24 parents and families, and I didn't include all the numbers because of time constraints, but parents did seek guardianship, and a new thing evolved, and that was co-guardianship, which I found was a very satisfying balance for the parents and the child. Transition to healthcare services. I did do a conference workshop for the Society of Pediatric Nursing. And through that workshop, developed a group nationwide to collaborate on development and resource of transition to healthcare from childhood to adult for children with autism. And parents or healthcare providers in that group had been in all aspects of healthcare. And some of these areas, specifically cardiac and cystic fibrosis, already have transitional programs in place where the pediatrician and the adult healthcare provider meet together with the child and the parent as a child transitions to adulthood. And I did publish a resource booklet for the Society of Pediatric Nursing. Violence, the biggest success in that theme was awareness and sharing, but it also brought forth the need for independent living. In independent living, at the beginning, 2 of 24, the parents had children who lived independently. By the time I finished with this work, 10 of the 24 lived independently. And I have not been in contact. And so I'm hoping that within the community, more have moved in that direction. The parents have initiated speakers. One parent brought in a speaker to talk about rights for adults with disabilities, and another from the housing community, disability housing assistance. Education, I was part of the development of a group at the university called iCares, interdisciplinary collaboration of autism research and education services. And through iCares, there have been several autism support groups developed through the university to support students, one through the University Women's Center and one through the Accessibility Center. The theme of employment, an adult with autism came in to talk about how he navigated his nightmares in the world of employment, and how he reframed himself to be who he was and not what he thought other people wanted him to be, dressed the way he wanted to and not the way other people thought he should dress. Developed a very creative business card that was 3-dimensional, so people didn't just take it and put it away, they took it and felt it and actually looked at it, and talked about his various strategies to navigate interviewing and then to navigate within his employment to stay employed. And he's now been employed for 8 years, which is the longest he's ever been employed, and he is 44 years old. That same adult came and talked to the group about socialization and how he developed an online gaming group, an in-person gaming group, and those groups have developed and branched off into different types of gaming groups. One of the parents developed Dogs with Vests as a means for socialization, and this was big because this was a mom of a lower functioning child. And it's been a very successful program. And expectations became a theme, and parents began to seriously consider that their expectations for their child really affected the success of their child navigating school and navigating employment, navigating the social world. And so parents began to speak up at meetings and encourage other parents and advise parents on ways that they could manage the challenging situations that they had at home. And so my organizational development and involvement during this period, of which I had the grant, was the Autism Society of Southeastern Wisconsin, and managing a support group of parents of adult children. The community of practice through the Weisman Center in Madison, presenting and bringing in parents to the Urban Autism Summit in Milwaukee, which serviced the Milwaukee metropolitan area. And then the collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration of autism research and education scholarship at UWM. And you can see the next slide, my publications and presentations and the workshops. And I did have one political aspect of that was a branch of this study. And we titled it Preventing Special Children from Getting Lost in the Tunnel. And this was related to the violence associated with people with disabilities, particularly people with social communication disorders or difficulty communicating, and met with the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families. And just yesterday, as luck would have it, I was able to meet a person who was a political liaison for General Electric, and the ultrasound development and research that they do. And she will meet with me and work with me to help me navigate to be more successful in navigating the whole political arena and legislation, and how to make those inroads. My most significant experience was MNRS. I would have to say having this grant, because it provided these opportunities. I'm also grateful to have been a chair of the qualitative research rig. We were able to really promote phenomenological research and rigorous phenomenological research in that rig. I was part of the education rig as well. I'm an abstract reviewer and consider myself to have been very involved and presented in every MNRS conference since I became a member. So thank you.